A notary shows up at a billionaire CEO's doorstep with a baby. "Hi sir, I'm here on behalf of your girlfriend. She wanted you to have him." The man tries to tell him he's wrong, as he doesn't recall ever having a proper girlfriend, before freezing in shock at the name on the will. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The elevator chimed softly as Stephen grimly leaned against the mirrored wall, massaging his temples. The aftertaste of overpriced scotch lingered, and the dull throb behind his eyes warned that sleep would be a lost cause. He adjusted his cufflinks out of habit, glancing at the blurry reflection of a man who had just closed a deal worth more than some countries' annual budgets. The numbers were good, everything else was noise. The doors slid open to the penthouse lobby, and Stephen took a step forward, nearly colliding with a man standing stiffly by the entrance. The man wore a dark suit, tie perfectly knotted, and held a baby carrier with the rigid discomfort of someone tasked with a job well outside their expertise. The baby, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, gurgled contentedly, then promptly spat up. Stephen stared at the white streak on his $1,000 suit, blinking in disbelief. "Mr. Grimley?" the man said, voice carefully polite. Stephen pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's 2 in the morning. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." The man cleared his throat, adjusting his grip on the carrier. "I'm not selling anything, sir. My name is Samuel Clark. I'm a notary. I've been instructed to deliver him." Stephen followed the notary's gaze to the baby, who blinked up at him with startlingly blue eyes. This had to be a prank. Frank had gone too far this time. "And I suppose there's a camera crew hiding in the ferns," Stephen muttered, brushing at the stain on his suit. Samuel's expression remained neutral as he reached into his briefcase, pulling out a sealed envelope. "I assure you, this is no prank. I was retained by Ms. Isabel Lane, the mother of this child. Your son." The words fell flat, not sinking in at first. Stephen barked out a short laugh, but the notary's face didn't flicker. No hidden smile, no camera crew leaping out to shout surprise. Just the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning and the soft coo of the baby in the carrier. Stephen took the letter, hesitating a moment before breaking the seal. Isabel's handwriting was neat, looping. He hadn't seen it in a long time. In fact, he hadn't seen her in a long time. She was an old flame who he reunited with every few months, when the loneliness was too much to handle. "Stephen, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. I wish I could have told you sooner, but I didn't want to complicate things for you. Jonas is your son. All I ask is that you give him a chance to know you. You don't have to be perfect. Just try. Love, Isabel." He read it twice, then once more, the words blurring at the edges. His grip on the paper tightened, but his mind latched onto one thing. Your son. The baby squirmed in the carrier, lips puckering with a tiny hiccup. Stephen looked from the letter to the notary, waiting for the punchline that never came. "I can arrange for a paternity test," Samuel offered smoothly, misinterpreting the silence. Stephen snapped out of it, shoving the letter into his pocket. "No, that's fine. Whatever. Just get him inside before the neighbors call security." They moved to the living room, the notary placing the carrier gently on the white leather couch. Stephen winced at the thought of spit up on the Italian leather but said nothing. The baby's eyes tracked him, a tiny fist waving aimlessly. Samuel handed over a folder with legal documents, explaining Isabel's will and the arrangements she'd made. Stephen heard the words but retained nothing beyond the dull roar in his ears. His gaze kept drifting to Jonas, who yawned with a small whimper that shot panic straight through him. "So what, she just leaves me a baby and expects me to?" He gestured vaguely, fighting the urge to pour a drink at 2 in the morning. "There's got to be someone else. A grandparent, a cousin? Somebody with experience." Her only wish was for Jonas to be with his father, Samuel replied, glancing at his watch. "If you refuse, he'll go to the state until a permanent arrangement can be found." Stephen opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again when Jonas let out a tiny wail. The sound was so pitiful and raw that Stephen's hand moved on instinct, patting the blanket with an awkwardness that bordered on painful. The baby quieted, eyes blinking drowsily, and Stephen stared at the small face with something like terror. After Samuel left, the silence stretched thin. Stephen paced the living room, still wearing the suit that now smelled faintly of formula. Every time he passed the couch, Jonas's eyes followed, wide and curious. "You have to be kidding me," Stephen muttered, scrubbing a hand down his face. The baby hiccuped in response, tiny fingers curling and uncurling as if waving. Half an hour later, Stephen stood in the kitchen, one hand gripping a damp towel as he scowled at the streaks of spit up on his shoes. The designer leather was likely ruined, which felt like a metaphor for his entire night. Or his life, possibly. Jonas's cries escalated, a high-pitched protest that made Stephen flinch. He tried bouncing the carrier, reciting the quarterly revenue numbers under his breath until he realized how ridiculous that was. He gave in with a sigh, scooping the baby into arms that felt far too clumsy for the task. Jonas squirmed, then settled, a tiny head nestled under Stephen's chin. The sudden quiet was jarring. The baby yawned and blinked, fingers latching onto Stephen's tie with surprising strength. The fabric stretched, a sticky trail of drool soaking in, but Stephen found he couldn't move. "You're not making this easy, you know," he murmured, more to himself than anything. Jonas's eyes drifted closed, a soft snuffle leaving his mouth. Stephen hesitated, then shifted the baby to one arm and tried to mimic what he'd seen in movies, gentle pats and a low voice. He felt absurd. Incredibly, painfully absurd. The baby was warm and impossibly tiny, clutching Stephen's finger with a grip far stronger than seemed fair. Then Jonas burped, loud enough to echo in the silent room. Stephen snorted despite himself, a sound halfway between disbelief and something softer. "Great. You're going to fit right in," he muttered, adjusting his hold with awkward care. But Jonas's breathing evened out, tiny fingers still curled tight around Stephen's. For the first time that night, Stephen stopped glancing at the clock. He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging with it. The city lights blurred through the glass windows, and for a moment, Stephen stood motionless, listening to the soft inhales and exhales of the baby sleeping against his chest. "Fine," he murmured, resigned. "I guess we'll figure it out." The next morning came too quickly, dragging Stephen out of a fitful sleep. His shirt was still crumpled from the night before, and the dull ache behind his eyes hadn't lessened. He squinted at the digital clock, then at the crib by the bed, half expecting the previous night to have been some bizarre nightmare. But Jonas was very real, kicking his tiny legs with surprising enthusiasm and gurgling with the sort of joy that seemed almost offensive given how Stephen felt. Before Stephen could even sit up properly, Jonas's face scrunched up, and the wail that followed could have shattered glass. An hour later, Stephen was on his knees in the nursery, battling with a diaper that might as well have been a straitjacket for all the sense it made. The instructions on the box were useless. After 5 failed attempts, one of which involved a small explosion of baby powder that left him coughing and covered in a white cloud, Stephen dropped back against the wall, defeated. Jonas, freed from the half-fastened diaper, giggled and kicked, one foot connecting with Stephen's tie, smearing it with something that definitely wasn't baby powder. "You're doing this on purpose," Stephen muttered, yanking off the tie with a grimace. Jonas laughed harder, tiny fingers flailing. It was the third night of this chaos when Stephen finally reached his limit. The crying had started at midnight, and showed no signs of stopping. Stephen had tried everything, bouncing, pacing, desperate pleas that no one would ever hear. Jonas's face was beet red, his small fists trembling with the force of his protests. Half out of his mind and desperate for silence, Stephen found himself dialing Frank's number. It rang 4 times before a groggy, thoroughly unamused voice answered. "You'd better be dying," Frank grumbled. Stephen glared at the ceiling, cradling the phone between his shoulder and ear. "I might be," he snapped. "How do you make a baby stop crying?" There was a long pause, then a snort of laughter. You have a baby? Did you kidnap it or something? I'm hanging up, Stephen warned. Wait. Frank wheezed between chuckles. You're serious? A fresh round of screams erupted, loud enough that Frank cursed. All right, I'm on my way. Don't kill it before I get there. Half an hour later, Frank stepped into the penthouse, eyes widening at the sight of bottles, blankets, and baby toys strewn across what was normally a pristine living room. Stephen was bouncing Jonas in what was probably meant to be a soothing manner but looked more like someone trying to shake water out of a towel. You look like something a cat coughed up, Frank observed. Do you want to hold him or not? Stephen snapped, already shoving Jonas into Frank's arms. Frank awkwardly took the baby, who sniffled a few times before glaring up with watery eyes. To everyone's shock, Jonas quieted almost instantly, blinking up at Frank with a small hiccup. Stephen ran a hand down his face, slumping into the couch. Of course you have some kind of baby magic. It's not magic, Frank said dryly, shifting Jonas until he was more secure. It's called not treating him like a ticking bomb. Stephen shot him a look. Helpful. Thanks. They made it a full 5 minutes before the argument started. Frank, tired and grumpy, lost patience the second Stephen mentioned finding an adoptive family. Seriously? You're just going to dump him because it's inconvenient? Frank snapped. He's your son, Stephen. You can't just throw money at him and hope he disappears. Don't start, Stephen warned, voice tight. But Frank had never known when to quit. Is this really about Jonas, or are you just scared to grow up? Before Stephen could respond, Jonas made a tiny sound, halfway between a sigh and a burp, that splattered directly onto Frank's shoulder. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank froze, eyes narrowed. Stephen's lips twitched despite the tension, a laugh slipping out before he could stop it. It wasn't much, barely more than a breath, but it was enough to crack the ice. Frank stared down at the stain with utter betrayal. Your kid is a menace. Now who's the drama queen? Stephen snorted, reaching to take Jonas back. The baby clung to his shirt, warm and solid, and Stephen's chest tightened with something uncomfortably close to affection. Later that night, when the apartment was quiet again, Jonas's fussing started up, tiny whimpers building into full-blown sobs. The exhausted part of Stephen wanted to pull a pillow over his head and pretend it wasn't happening, but Jonas's cries were raw, trembling, and Stephen found himself dragging out of bed on autopilot. He scooped Jonas up, bouncing him gently while muttering nonsense. The lullabies his mother used to sing came out half-formed and awkward, the lyrics a mix of boardroom jargon and off-key humming. To his disbelief, Jonas quieted. His wide eyes fixed on Stephen's face, one tiny hand curling around Stephen's thumb. You're easy to please, Stephen muttered, voice rough. Must have got that from your mother. Jonas yawned, eyes drifting closed, and Stephen let out a shaky breath, shifting to sit back on the bed with the baby curled against his chest. The room was dark and still, the city lights casting soft patterns across the walls. Stephen's shoulders relaxed, tension bleeding away. He stayed like that for a while, one hand on Jonas's back, breathing slow to match the tiny rise and fall of the baby's chest. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat still for this long without a phone in his hand or a deal in progress. Jonas's small fingers tightened briefly, clutching at Stephen's shirt even in sleep. The warmth in Stephen's chest grew, unexpected and unsettling. He hesitated, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to tell him what to do next. But the only sound was Jonas's soft breaths and the distant hum of traffic. Fine, Stephen mumbled eventually, voice a touch hoarse. I'll give it a try. But if you throw up on me again, all bets are off. Jonas made a tiny snuffling sound, shifting closer, and Stephen rolled his eyes, though the effect was ruined by the way he adjusted the blanket more securely around the baby. Yeah, I love you too, he grumbled, half smiling. By the time Jonas was 8 months old, Stephen had abandoned all pretense of control. Mornings were a chaotic blend of lukewarm coffee, mismatched socks, and diaper catastrophes that defied the laws of nature. His office, once a haven of efficiency and order, was now littered with pacifiers and half-empty bottles that the cleaning staff had stopped trying to relocate. Sleep was a distant memory. Jonas's sleep schedule was less of a schedule and more of a personal vendetta against Stephen's sanity. He'd finally collapse into bed only for Jonas to start up again, wailing with the kind of lung capacity that made Stephen wonder if choir practice was in the kid's future. At first, Stephen had tried hiring a team of nannies, all highly recommended and all fleeing within a week. By the fourth resignation, one of them had the nerve to pat his arm and suggest that maybe Jonas just wanted his father. The comment stung enough to keep Stephen up longer than the crying did. His company was beginning to show cracks. Board meetings had turned into a blur of PowerPoint slides and drowsy head nodding. During one particularly brutal presentation, Stephen jolted awake mid-snore and muttered, "Who's a good boy?" at a very startled board member. The look on their faces was almost worth the embarrassment. By the time Frank heard about it, the story had already spread to half the senior staff. "You need help," Frank declared over drinks one night, eyes glinting with amusement. "And not just the babysitter kind." Stephen scowled, swirling his glass with a little more force than necessary. "What I need is a full night's sleep and a mute button," Frank snorted. "Good luck with that." The nanny, a woman named Rosa who seemed immune to Stephen's glare, cornered him a week later. Jonas had started waking up screaming, tiny hands trembling, the kind of cries that left Stephen frozen and helpless. Rosa explained it gently, her eyes kind. "Babies could grieve too," she said. Jonas was likely mourning his mother in his own way, processing the loss even without understanding it. The words made Stephen's chest tighten uncomfortably. So he ended up in a child therapist's office on a Tuesday afternoon, Jonas balanced on his knee and chewing determinedly on one of Stephen's tie clips. The therapist was soft-spoken, her office filled with plush animals and pastel walls that made Stephen feel like he was the one who needed a session. She explained that Jonas's nightmares were normal, that the crying was part of the process. She suggested ways to help, routine, comfort, familiar voices. Stephen, overwhelmed and exhausted, could only offer a half-hearted, "Great, so therapy runs in the family." The therapist's lips twitched, but she let the comment pass without judgment. That night, desperate to try anything, Stephen found himself in the nursery with a storybook in one hand and Jonas half asleep against his chest. Reading aloud felt ridiculous. The voices were worse, his attempt at a British accent for a talking rabbit nearly made him cringe out of his own skin. But Jonas giggled, delighted by every awkward lilt and dramatic pause. For the first time in days, the crying stopped. Jonas blinked up at him, wide-eyed and fascinated, one chubby fist tangled in Stephen's sleeve. Stephen cleared his throat, flipping the page. And then, he tried, voice rough and uncertain. The brave little rabbit said, something about carrots. "Honestly, who writes these things?" Jonas's giggles bubbled up, bright and infectious, and Stephen found himself grinning back, tired but warm. He kept reading, accents getting bolder, voice smoothing out with every laugh Jonas rewarded him with. The stories became a nightly ritual, a small anchor in the chaos. The nightmares faded slowly. Jonas's cries lessened, the dark circles under Stephen's eyes became slightly less permanent, and the nanny stopped giving him that pitying look every time he stumbled into the kitchen at dawn. Somehow, the routine settled. Work still bled into late nights, emails piled up, and Frank's texts ranged from mildly concerned to outright threats. But Stephen found himself looking forward to bedtime. Found himself lingering in the nursery long after Jonas's breathing evened out, reading just one more page. He started keeping a bag of soft toys in his office, a bottle of formula in the corner of his desk. The board stopped blinking every time Jonas's babbling came through on speakerphone. His assistant learned to schedule meetings around nap times. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Stephen almost fell asleep in the rocking chair, Jonas curled warm and limp against his chest. The nursery was dark, the nightlight casting faint stars across the ceiling. The book slipped from Stephen's fingers, landing softly on the rug. He shifted, blinking blearily, and almost cursed when his foot caught on something hard and small. The toy car skidded out of sight with a clatter, and Stephen gritted his teeth, holding his breath until Jonas sighed but didn't wake. Carefully, Stephen eased them both back, adjusting the blanket and smoothing a hand over Jonas's soft hair. The baby's fist tightened instinctively, holding fast to a wrinkle of Stephen's shirt, tiny and impossibly trusting. Stephen swallowed, clearing the lump from his throat. "Good night, kid," he mumbled, voice quiet in the darkness. He reached for the door, careful and slow. He was almost in the hallway when his foot caught again, and the small plastic dinosaur sent him stumbling. The curse slipped out half-formed before he snapped his mouth shut, wobbling in place with a wild windmill of arms that would have been humiliating if anyone had seen. Jonas snuffled in his sleep, oblivious, and Stephen exhaled shakily, leaning a moment against the doorframe to steady himself. The silence settled back, warm and steady, the first real peace he'd felt in weeks. He watched Jonas for a moment longer, exhaustion pulling at every nerve, but the ache in his chest was something softer, almost content. The idea of leaving, of handing Jonas over to someone else, seemed less and less plausible every time Jonas looked at him with that unwavering trust. With a last deep breath, Stephen turned off the light and closed the door gently behind him, fingers lingering on the handle for just a second longer than necessary. By the time Jonas was old enough to toddle around the penthouse with alarming speed, Stephen had perfected the art of juggling conference calls and emergency diaper changes. His office was still a sanctuary of glass and chrome, but the desk drawers hid teething toys and the lower shelves held picture books instead of binders. The boardroom had seen more than one stuffed dinosaur make an appearance, usually clutched in Jonas's small fists, as he made a beeline for his dad mid-meeting. No one dared comment after the first few times. Even Frank had learned to keep a straight face, though his texts were less subtle. "Your spawn just stormed the quarterly review. Pretty sure he's got a future in hostile takeovers." Stephen snorted when he saw it, glancing at the tiny whirlwind currently appending his inbox and making a game of scattering papers across the office rug. Jonas looked up at the sound, grinning wide and toothy, and Stephen's glare lost its edge. It wasn't sustainable, though, and everyone knew it. Jonas's school interviews were getting more frequent, and so were the complaints from shareholders. The video that leaked didn't help, Stephen, Ty Askew, trying to balance a baby bottle with his phone propped against his shoulder, snapping orders to a CFO while Jonas made a valiant attempt to grab the phone cord. By the time it hit 2 million views, Stephen had stopped checking his email. The day of the takeover attempt started like any other. Jonas was refusing to eat breakfast, favoring the dog's kibble over the oatmeal Stephen had painstakingly made. The conference call on mergers ran 30 minutes over. Jonas squirmed in his lap the entire time, and Frank's voice kept breaking in to remind Stephen of the afternoon board meeting. When the call finally ended, Stephen leaned back with a sigh, running a hand through his hair. Jonas, apparently taking this as a cue, latched onto the phone and promptly threw it across the room. A few hours later, Stephen was in a suit that still smelled faintly of oatmeal, Jonas strapped into a car seat that had taken more engineering skills than most of his acquisitions. The school they were visiting was pristine, all red bricks and immaculate lawns, and the receptionist's smile faltered only slightly when Jonas dropped a soggy cracker on the brochure display. The interview started well enough, until Jonas decided the headmaster's tie was the most fascinating thing in the world and yanked it with a gleeful shriek. Stephen, halfway between prying tiny fingers loose and offering an apology, almost didn't notice the looks being exchanged. The drive back was quiet, Jonas snoring softly in the back seat. Stephen drummed his fingers against the wheel, watching the city blur past, wondering if every parent felt this off balance all the time. When he got to the office, the board meeting was already in full swing. Frank's glare was half frustration, half relief, but Stephen was too tired to care. The numbers on the screen blurred together, profits, losses, projections, all bleeding into one steady hum of problems to fix. The door cracked open halfway through a slide on international markets, and Stephen glanced up, startled, to see the nanny shifting nervously with Jonas in her arms. "He wouldn't stop crying," she whispered, apologetic. "I didn't know if you—" Stephen was already pushing back his chair, ignoring the startled looks and whispered protests. Jonas's face was red and blotchy, eyes bright with fresh tears. He hiccuped pitifully, tiny fists clutching Stephen's tie the moment he was close enough. The board members stared, half horror, half fascination. Frank rolled his eyes, muttering something that sounded suspiciously like "softe" under his breath. Stephen tightened his hold on Jonas, ignoring the way his suit wrinkled and the smears of tears and drool soaking into his collar. "Meeting adjourned," he said shortly, voice flat. "We'll continue this tomorrow." The silence that followed was deafening. Back at the penthouse, after a dinner that involved more mashed peas on the floor than in Jonas, Stephen barely had time to breathe before Frank showed up, eyes narrowed and arms crossed. "You've got a problem," Frank declared, striding past the door without waiting for an invitation. "If this is about the oatmeal thing, this is about you tanking your own company," Frank snapped. "You missed the vote on the merger. The board's circling like vultures. You've got to make a choice, Stephen. You can't keep doing both." The words struck harder than they should have. Stephen clenched his jaw, shifting Jonas on his hip when he started squirming. "He's my son," he said evenly. "And you're a CO," Frank shot back. "You think I don't get it? I do. But this half-in, half-out thing, you're going to lose both." Jonas, sensing the tension, made a small distressed noise, face scrunching up. Without thinking, Stephen bounced him gently, murmuring nonsense until the sniffles faded. Frank's glare softened a fraction, but he didn't back down. "Didn't think you could handle a kid," he muttered after a moment, the words almost grudging. Stephen snorted, shifting Jonas's weight. "Didn't think he could handle me." That pulled a reluctant chuckle from Frank, the tension easing slightly. "You're a pain," he muttered, but the words lacked heat. "Look, just figure it out, all right? For his sake." By the time Frank left, Jonas was nodding off, small head drooping against Stephen's shoulder. The apartment was dark and quiet, the city lights a soft glow through the windows. Stephen carried him to the nursery, moving carefully to avoid the scattered toys that had nearly killed him more than once. The night light cast pale stars across the ceiling, and Jonas blinked drowsily as Stephen tucked him in, tiny fists rubbing at his eyes. Just as Stephen straightened, Jonas's hand shot out, clutching his sleeve with surprising force. His eyes were half closed, voice slurred with sleep, but the words were unmistakable. "Love you, Daddy," he mumbled, soft and warm and unguarded. Stephen's breath caught, throat tight. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak, the words knocking loose something deep and aching in his chest. He managed a half-smile, fingers brushing softly over Jonas's hair. "Well, that makes one of us," he muttered, voice a little hoarse. Jonas made a small, content noise, already drifting off, and Stephen stayed a moment longer, watching the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The tension drained from his shoulders, replaced by something warmer and deeper, something that made the chaos of the day seem almost bearable. He straightened slowly, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and turned off the light with a soft click, closing the door behind him. The weeks passed in a blur of board meetings, playdates, and late-night story sessions that left Stephen bleary-eyed but unwilling to stop. Jonas's voice was clearer now, his steps faster, and the nights of endless crying were behind them, replaced by giggles and the occasional tantrum that left Stephen more amused than frustrated. It was almost easy to forget the balancing act, the strain of splitting his life between spreadsheets and school pickup lines. The morning of the business trip, Stephen crouched in the foyer, adjusting the Velcro on Jonas's shoes while Jonas rattled off an excited recount of a cartoon he'd seen. "I'll be back by Friday," Stephen promised, pressing a kiss to Jonas's head, ignoring the smirk Frank shot his way. "Be good for Rosa." Jonas grinned wide, tiny fingers clutching Stephen's tie like a lifeline. "Bring me a plane." "Bit big for your toy box," Stephen snorted, ruffling his hair. How about a keychain? Jonas's pout was immediate and fierce, but Rose's gentle coaxing got him to let go, and Stephen forced himself to turn away, pushing down the uneasy tug low in his gut. The flight started normal enough. The private jet was quiet, engines a steady hum beneath the business calls that dragged on and on, every voice blurring together in a monotone drone. Stephen pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaustion pulling at the edges of his mind. He was just starting to drift when the jolt came, hard enough to send his phone skittering across the floor. The overhead lights flickered, engine sputtering with a wheeze that sent a chill down his spine. The co-pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, too calm to be reassuring. We're experiencing an engine malfunction. Please secure your seatbelts. Stephen's fingers were clumsy, fumbling with the buckle as the plane lurched again, metal groaning with a sickening shudder. The oxygen mask dropped with a hiss, swinging lazily, and his pulse jumped hard and fast. His hands moved on autopilot, tugging the mask over his face, heart hammering loud enough to drown out the rising panic in the cabin. For a breathless second, all he could think of was Jonas. Wide blue eyes, tiny fists clutching at his tie, a sleepy, "Love you, Daddy," whispered from under star-patterned sheets. The thought twisted sharp in his chest, cutting through the fear with something deeper and colder. The emergency landing was brutal. The impact jarred every bone, and the seatbelt bit into his chest hard enough to bruise. By the time the dust settled, Stephen's hands were still locked white-knuckled to the armrests, breath coming fast and shallow. The paramedics moved with clipped efficiency, checking vitals and strapping oxygen masks with gentle but firm hands. Stephen barely heard them, the words muffled under the static in his ears. His ribs ached with every breath, pain flaring sharp and bright. He spent the night in a hospital room, monitors beeping soft and steady, walls too white and too close. The painkillers dulled the ache but couldn't touch the fear, the gut-deep terror of what could have been. Frank showed up the next morning, a cup of gas station coffee in one hand and a glare in the other. "You look like death," he greeted, slumping into the chair by the bed. "Good to see you too," Stephen muttered, voice rough. Frank took a long, loud slurp of coffee. "Honestly, I'm impressed. Figured you were too stubborn to die." The snort that escaped was half laugh, half wince. "Just couldn't leave you to handle the quarterly report," Stephen mumbled. Frank's chuckle was soft, almost relieved. The silence stretched after that, easy and comfortable, and Stephen stared at the ceiling tiles, mind drifting back to Jonas, his grin, the way his small fingers tangled in Stephen's shirt, the sleepy mumble of goodnights that had become the highlight of Stephen's days. The thought of never hearing it again made his breath hitch, a fresh wave of cold fear settling deep in his bones. He clenched his hands into the hospital sheets, jaw tight. When the doctor finally cleared him to leave, the first stop Stephen made was home. Jonas met him at the door with a high-pitched squeal, barreling into his legs with all the force a 4-year-old could muster. "You're back!" Jonas crowed, small arms winding around Stephen's legs. "You didn't bring me a plane!" Stephen huffed a laugh, bending to scoop him up despite the protest in his ribs. "Guess you'll have to settle for me," he murmured, voice rough. Jonas snuggled closer, tiny fingers twisting in Stephen's collar, and the knot in Stephen's chest eased a little. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings and doctors' follow-ups, but the fear stayed, a low thrum under every breath. Stephen hired 2 new senior managers, pushing off more projects, shifting schedules to leave his evenings open. Jonas's soccer practice became a weekly ritual, Stephen pacing the sidelines in a suit, tie abandoned and sleeves rolled up. His assistant, Clara, learned to forward calls and emails during game time, and the shareholders stopped blinking at the sound of Jonas's chatter during conference calls. The science fair was a disaster. Jonas, bright-eyed and determined, insisted on a baking soda volcano. The kitchen was left dusted in white, the printer malfunctioned in a puff of smoke, and Stephen's suit bore the brunt of the fallout. Jonas's wide-eyed apology was dampened by the giggles he couldn't hold back, and Stephen's exasperated glare lost the battle against a fond smile. By the time the soccer finals rolled around, Steven's schedule was a mess of postponed meetings and half-written emails. But he showed up early, thermos of coffee in hand, eyes tracking every move Jonas made on the field. When Jonas's foot connected with the ball, clumsy but determined, and sent it soaring, Steven held his breath. The ball sailed past the goalie, bouncing into the net with a wobble, and the field exploded in cheers. Steven's shout was loud enough to carry across the grass. "That's my boy!" he hollered, unfiltered joy breaking through, face splitting in a grin that left his cheeks aching. A few parents turned to stare, but Steven couldn't bring himself to care. Jonas's face lit up, eyes finding Steven's in the crowd, a grin wide and toothy spreading across his face. Steven leaned against the fence, breath catching in his throat, heart pounding with a mix of pride and something deeper, warmer. Jonas bounded over, flushed and breathless, arms flung wide, and Steven caught him easily, ignoring the grass stains and dirt smearing his suit. "You saw, Daddy?" Jonas gasped, words tripping over themselves. "Did you see?" Steven chuckled, ruffling his hair. "I saw, champ," he murmured. "You were amazing." Jonas's eyes gleamed, chest puffing up with pride, and Steven's throat tightened, the ache back but softer this time. The sun dipped lower, casting gold over the field, and Steven stood there for a moment longer, Jonas's weight warm and solid in his arms, the distant buzz of city noise a faint hum under the steady beat of his heart. The years slipped by faster than Steven had ever thought possible. One day, Jonas was grinning through a gap-toothed smile, waving a soccer trophy over his head. The next, he was slamming doors and rolling his eyes with the kind of exasperation only teenagers could muster. The change was gradual but relentless, each inch Jonas gained in height a reminder of how little time was left. The nursery was packed away, the star-patterned night light replaced by posters and sneakers and a computer desk perpetually buried in wires and textbooks. Steven learned to navigate the minefield of teenage moods, biting back the urge to nag when Jonas missed curfew or forgot to call. Teaching Jonas to drive was a fresh kind of torture. Steven had stared down boardrooms of sharks without flinching, but the sight of Jonas's knuckles white on the steering wheel nearly stopped his heart. The first practice ended with a near miss against the garden hedge, Steven's panicked cry of "Brake! Brake!" echoing through the car. Jonas, pale and wide-eyed, pulled over with shaking hands, mumbling apologies that tripped over each other. Steven, heart still pounding, let out a shaky laugh that startled them both, the terror ebbing into something softer as Jonas's shoulders eased. They sat there for a minute, the engine ticking quietly, and Steven ruffled Jonas's hair, chuckling at the indignant huff it earned. "Could have been worse," he said lightly. "You missed the mailbox, at least." Jonas's glare was half-hearted, mouth twitching despite himself. The next round went smoother, Steven's voice guiding gentle and steady, and by the time they made it back to the driveway, Jonas's grin was wide and breathless, eyes bright with pride. The college applications were another hurdle, deadlines looming and essays piling up. Jonas filled the house with the click of keyboards and frantic phone calls, coffee mugs multiplying on every flat surface. Steven found himself playing editor, reading drafts late into the night, biting back tears at every mention of sacrifices made and lessons learned. The acceptance letter came on a rainy afternoon, the envelope crumpled from Jonas's nervous hands. He tore it open in the foyer, eyes flicking over the words once, twice, before snapping to Steven with a stunned grin. "I got in," Jonas breathed, voice high and disbelieving. Dad, I got in." Steven barely had time to set down the briefcase before Jonas barreled into him, arms tight around his middle, voice muffled in his shirt. The letter fluttered to the floor, and Steven's vision blurred as he hugged back, heart too full to fit in his chest. They went for ice cream to celebrate, Jonas leaning over the counter with the same intensity he brought to board games and soccer drills. Steven ordered vanilla, earning a dramatic eye roll, and they bickered over toppings until the server choked back a laugh. They sat on the hood of the car, legs swinging, Jonas's face soft in the streetlights. The night was warm, the city quiet, and Stephen found himself talking without meaning to, about college, business, the way the world could grind a person down if they let it. Jonas listened, spoon pausing between bites, nodding with the seriousness that always made him seem older than he was. His questions were sharp and thoughtful, and Stephen answered every one, voice low and easy, pride swelling with every chuckle and head tilt. The first heartbreak came a month later. Jonas stormed in red-eyed and furious, phone clutched in white-knuckled hands, words spilling out in a broken rush. Stephen, blindsided and helpless, did the only thing he could think of, pulled Jonas into a hug and let him vent, awkward pats turning steady as Jonas's breathing evened out. They ended up on the couch, a movie playing low in the background, Jonas's head on Stephen's shoulder, sniffling turning to soft breaths. The hospital scare was a punch to the gut. One moment, Stephen was fine, overworked and exhausted, but fine. The next, he was on his back with fluorescent lights blurring above him and Frank's voice sharp and scared in his ear. The diagnosis wasn't as bad as it could have been: exhaustion, stress, a warning to slow down before it was too late. But the sight of Jonas bursting through the door, tie askew and eyes wide with terror, nearly broke him. Jonas's hands trembled as they clutched Stephen's, voice shaking with too many questions and not enough answers. Stephen, groggy but alive, squeezed back, murmuring reassurances until Jonas's shoulders stopped shaking. A week later, bedridden and cranky, Stephen nearly dropped his phone when a text from Jonas buzzed through, a photo of Jonas in the CEO chair, feet kicked up on the desk, grin wide and teasing. The caption read, "Look at me, I'm the captain now." Stephen snorted so hard it pulled his stitches. His reply was half curse, half laugh, and Jonas's string of crying laughing emojis kept him company through the next few hours of hospital food and daytime TV. Jonas visited every day, sometimes bringing notes from meetings, sometimes just leaning back in the visitor's chair and recounting office gossip with a smirk. By the time Stephen was cleared to leave, he could recite half the board members' complaints by heart. The wedding proposal was the final blow. Jonas, practically vibrating with nerves, had rehearsed the speech a dozen times in the mirror, dragging Stephen into the kitchen at ungodly hours to listen. When the day came, Stephen lingered at the back of the restaurant, hard hammering in a way that seemed unfair given he wasn't the one doing the proposing. Jonas's voice was low and earnest, hands shaking but steady as he dropped to one knee, eyes soft and sure. The yes came with tears and laughter, and Stephen had to swipe at his own eyes, pretending not to see the knowing look Frank shot him. Jonas's grin was blinding, cheeks flushed, eyes never leaving his fiancée's. Stephen swallowed hard, something deep and raw clogging his throat, watching his son stand tall and bright and sure, no trace of the gap-toothed boy clutching soccer trophies. When Jonas turned, eyes shining and lips quirked with barely contained joy, Stephen chuckled, voice hoarse. "Just don't propose the way I did," he teased, sniffling. Jonas laughed, bright and unrestrained, and Stephen's chest ached with too many feelings to name. The room blurred at the edges, the noise dimming to a soft buzz under the steady, grounding warmth of Jonas's smile. They hugged tight, arms firm and familiar, and Stephen clapped him on the back, breath catching, voice rough with everything he couldn't fit into words. The restaurant lights glinted warm and gold, laughter ringing out soft and sweet, and Stephen stood there a moment longer, eyes damp, heart full, watching the next chapter of Jonas's life unfold with a smile that didn't fade. The hospital room was warm and bright, sunlight spilling in soft squares across the tiles. Stephen leaned back in the stiff armchair, eyes half closed but alert, one leg bouncing with the kind of nervous energy he hadn't felt since Jonas was born. Frank, lounging in the chair opposite, flicked through a magazine with feigned nonchalance, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Calm down," he drawled. "You're gonna sprain something." Stephen shot him a glare that lacked heat, but before he could snap back, the door creaked open. Jonas appeared, eyes tired but gleaming, hair mussed and smile wide. In his arms, wrapped in a yellow blanket that seemed far too big, was the smallest bundle Stephen had ever seen. Jonas's wife trailed close behind, exhausted but glowing, leaning into Jonas with a softness that made Stephen's throat tighten. Jonas crossed the room in a few strides, eyes crinkling as he eased the bundle into Stephen's arms with a grin that was half nervous, half proud. "Dad," Jonas murmured, voice thick. "Meet Lily." The weight was familiar but different, tiny and warm, little fingers peeking out, face scrunched in sleep. Stephen stared down, heart pounding loud and fast, hands careful and awkward around the soft blanket. Lily made a small, hiccuping sound, nose wrinkling, and Stephen held his breath, half afraid to move. When she blinked awake, eyes unfocused but bright, a toothless yawn pulling at her cheeks, something broke wide open in Stephen's chest. He let out a shaky breath, chuckling under his breath, voice rough. "She's cuter than you ever were," he muttered, shifting to cradle her closer, fingers brushing over wisps of dark hair. Jonas rolled his eyes, lips twitching. "Don't make me take her back," he warned, tone dry but eyes damp. Stephen snorted softly, but his eyes never left Lily's face, every breath careful and slow, terrified of waking her. The small fingers curled around his thumb, grip surprisingly firm, and Stephen's chest ached with something deep and tender, every breath tight and full. The next few months were a blur of late-night phone calls and frantic visits, Stephen showing up at the door with takeout and bags under his eyes, one hand always straying to Lily's bassinet. Jonas's apartment became a second home, filled with baby blankets and bottles, the kitchen light always on, laughter soft and warm under the steady hum of city traffic. Retirement came quieter than Stephen expected. The meeting was short and straightforward, papers signed with a pen that felt too heavy. Jonas stood beside him, expression a mix of nerves and pride, suit neatly pressed and hands clasped behind his back. Stephen watched him handle the board's questions with a steady voice and calm eyes, every answer measured and sure, and the knot of worry in his chest eased by degrees. He caught Frank's smirk from the corner of his eye and rolled his eyes, but the tension bled out of his shoulders, replaced by something softer, warmer. The office was packed into boxes that weekend. Photos and plaques wrapped in newspaper, paperweights and pens tossed into drawers with less care. Jonas took over the corner office with a mix of awe and uncertainty, glancing back every few minutes like he expected Stephen to snap at him for touching something. "You're the boss now," Stephen reminded dryly, watching Jonas hesitate by the desk. "Try to act like it." Jonas huffed, but his smile softened, fingers trailing over the desktop with something like reverence. "Just weird," he mumbled. "You not being here." Stephen snorted, clapping him on the back. "You'll get used to it," he said lightly, but the words were rough, the edges frayed. The empty office felt too quiet, walls bare and strange, the shadows too long and the view too bright. The days that followed were a slow shift, mornings without alarms, afternoons on the porch with coffee growing cold between his hands. Lily's laughter filled the empty spaces, small feet pattering across hardwood floors, babbling nonsense that left Stephen chuckling into his sleeve. Barbecues became a weekly thing, Jonas grilling with a frown of concentration, Frank tossing comments from the sidelines, Lily trailing behind with sticky fingers and wide eyes. The backyard was a mess of blankets and toys, the scent of smoke and charcoal, the air buzzing with laughter and the clink of glasses. Bedtime stories were back in the routine, the old books dug out of storage, pages worn but familiar. Lily sprawled in his lap, wide-eyed and clutching his shirt, breath catching at every plot twist, every dramatic pause. Jonas leaned against the doorframe some nights, arms crossed and smile soft, watching with a fondness that never failed to twist something deep in Stephen's chest. The stars outside blurred through the windows, city lights warm and steady, Lily's breathing soft against his collar. "You're getting sappy," Jonas teased one night, smirking. Stephen rolled his eyes, flipping a page with deliberate calm. "Keep talking, and I'll rewrite my will," he shot back, smirk sharp but eyes warm. Jonas snorted, ducking out with a wave and a chuckle, and Stephen huffed, brushing a soft hand over Lily's hair, the warmth in his chest spreading slow and steady. The box of letters was an afterthought, notes scribbled late at night, old receipts and napkins, messages jotted down between meetings and school runs. Jonas found it in the closet, buried under old suits and dusty ties, fingers pausing over the faded ink. They were simple, mostly advice, memories, things Stephen wished he'd said but never found the words for. A few were lighter, jokes and teases, doodles in the margins where meetings had dragged on too long. Jonas read them slow, eyes flicking over the words, fingers tracing the edges with a reverence that left Stephen's throat tight. Some letters brought chuckles, some shaky breaths, others a sharp inhale and a hand swiping quick over damp eyes. The last letter was short, words cramped and scrawled, ink blotched in the corners. "You've made me proud, kid. You've got this. P.S. No, you can't have my car." Jonas snorted, breath catching halfway, eyes stinging with something sharp and raw. He laughed, choking on it, voice breaking as he ran a thumb over the last line, blinking fast. Stephen leaned back in his chair, breath slow and steady, heart pounding with a warmth that spread through every limb, a deep, unshakable contentment settling in his chest. Lily's giggles rang out from the backyard, bright and sweet, Jonas's voice chasing after with a fond reprimand, and Stephen closed his eyes, smile softening, breath evening out slow and easy. The sun dipped low, painting the room in shades of amber and gold, and the house buzzed with life, voices warm and steady under the fading light. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled deep into the walls and muffled every sound. Soft lamplight cast warm pools across the floor, shadows stretching long and gentle, and the steady beep of the monitor was a slow, tired rhythm in the background. Stephen shifted against the thin pillows, breath coming short and shallow, hands pale against the blanket. The frailty in his limbs was a cruel kind of betrayal, bones heavy and muscles weak, but his mind was clear enough, memories bright and sharp. Photos lined the walls, frames propped on every available surface, Jonas grinning toothy and young, soccer trophies clutched high, Jonas in a suit, expression half proud, half terrified, signing his first contract, Lily's smile wide and gap-toothed, a smudge of dirt across her cheek. Stephen's gaze lingered on each one, fingers brushing absently at the blanket, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips. The door creaked open, soft and careful, and Jonas stepped in, movements hesitant but eyes warm. He was older now, shoulders broad and posture steady, a few gray strands woven into dark hair. But his eyes were still the same, bright and earnest, flickering with nerves that softened the moment Stephen's gaze met his. "Thought I told you to go home," Stephen rasped, voice thin but amused. Jonas huffed, setting a stack of old photo albums on the bedside table with a roll of his eyes. "Yeah, and when did I ever listen to you?" Stephen snorted, the sound breaking off into a cough that left him breathless, chest tight and aching. Jonas's face creased with concern, hands hovering awkwardly, but Stephen waved him off with a tired chuckle. Jonas pulled a chair up close, settling in with a careful sort of ease, fingers flipping open an album to a page of baby photos that had Stephen groaning. "If you even start with the diaper story, I'm writing you out of the will," Stephen warned, voice dry. Jonas's grin was all teeth, unrepentant and smug. "Too late," he shot back, tapping a photo of a much younger Stephen holding a very tiny, very naked Jonas at arm's length, face twisted in sheer horror. Laughter slipped out before Stephen could help it, quiet but warm, eyes crinkling despite the ache it pulled at. Jonas chuckled along, flipping pages with a smile that wavered at the edges, voice low and fond. They moved through years and moments, Jonas's first steps, his first bike ride, soccer games and graduations and late-night ice cream runs that ended in sprinkles all over the dashboard. Jonas's voice softened as he spoke, words turning thick and slow, eyes bright with unshed tears that he tried to blink away. Stephen listened, chest tight but heart full, each word a thread weaving through memories, binding past to present. He let his eyes close for a moment, breath slow and even, the warmth of Jonas's voice grounding, safe. When he blinked back awake, Jonas's hand was in his, fingers warm and solid, grip firm but careful. Stephen stared at the tan knuckles, the neat nails, the ring glinting faintly, and a breath shuddered loose from his chest, eyes prickling. Didn't think you had it in you. Stephen mumbled, lips twitching faintly, voice soft but steady. Jonas snorted, a watery chuckle slipping out, fingers squeezing a little tighter. Well, I had a pretty good example. He muttered, voice rough with something he couldn't quite swallow down. Stephen let out a breathless laugh, eyes fluttering shut, exhaustion pulling at the edges of his mind but warmth settling deep in his chest, steady and sure. I'm proud of you, he murmured, voice barely more than a breath but the words coming easy and true. Jonas's shoulders trembled, a half-sob breaking free, forehead dropping to the edge of the mattress as he choked out a laugh that cracked at the edges. They stayed like that for a while, Jonas's hand warm and tight around Stephen's, breaths coming slow and shaky, the room dim and soft, shadows pooling in the corners. The ache in Stephen's chest eased with each breath, the weight lifting bit by bit, eyes slipping shut and staying that way, lips quirking in the faintest smile. The beeping on the monitor slowed, each pulse softer than the last, until it faded into silence. The sun dipped lower through the blinds, painting the walls in shades of amber and gold, and Jonas stayed by the bedside long after the light faded, fingers still laced with his father's, tears slipping unchecked down his cheeks. The funeral was quiet, the sky gray but clear, a chill in the air that bit through wool coats, and stirred the grass around the headstones. Jonas stood by the grave, posture straight but shoulders trembling, fingers curled tight around Lily's small hand. She was 7 now, eyes too bright and red-rimmed, clutching a stuffed bear to her chest with a grip that left her knuckles white. Jonas squeezed her hand once, twice, grounding them both, throat tight and raw. They lingered after the others left, silence settling heavy and thick, the wind soft in the trees. Jonas stared at the polished stone, name etched deep and neat, breath hitching with every inhale. Lily's sniffles were small and broken, lashes damp, face tucked into her bear's matted fur. After a moment, she peeked up, voice small and wobbly. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Is Grandpa watching us now?" Jonas swallowed hard, breath catching, eyes stinging. He crouched to her level, brushing a thumb over a tear track with a shaky smile. "Yeah," he rasped, voice breaking but sure. "Always." Lily's bottom lip trembled, eyes bright and uncertain, but she sniffled and nodded, fingers tightening around Jonas's sleeve. He scooped her up, her arms winding around his neck, face pressing into his shoulder with a soft, hiccuping sob. Jonas closed his eyes, breath shuddering out slow and unsteady, and stood there for a moment longer, letting the wind tug at his coat and the silence settle deep. When he finally turned, cradling Lily close, the sky was streaked with orange and pink, the horizon stretched wide and endless. Lily's sniffles faded into soft breaths, eyes fluttering shut, fingers still tangled in his collar. Jonas glanced back once, eyes catching on the headstone, on the fresh flowers and the neat lines of carved letters, heart twisting and aching but a little lighter. The path ahead was long, the future uncertain, but Lily's weight was warm and solid in his arms, each step easier than the last, the sunset soft and gold at their backs. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one, I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.